It has been an extraordinary week as world leaders, celebrities, and ordinary South Africans gather to pay their final respects to Nelson Mandela. But what does the future hold for the new South Africa that he helped create? Major issues like poverty and inequality persist. And will Mandela's legacy as a revolutionary turned peacemaker continue to have an impact worldwide? We begin with Anand Naidoo and this story.
Nelson Mandela will be making his final journey from Pretoria, the South African capital, to the small village in the Eastern Cape region of South Africa, where he'll be buried in a hillside grave. The funeral is a largely private affair with only close family present. He'll be interred after a ceremony conducted according to the customs of his Amatemba tribe. Tens of thousands of people have made their way to this remote part of South Africa for the funeral. It's the culmination of more than a week of memorials, remembrances and celebrations which began after the dramatic announcement of his death on December 5th.
Our beloved Nelson Mandela, the founding president of our democratic nation, has departed.
More than 90 world leaders arrived for a moving memorial service at the 90,000-seat FNB Stadium in Johannesburg. Ironically, it was the same place where Mandela made his last public appearance at the Soccer World Cup in 2010. For the past 3 days, tens of thousands of people have filed past his casket as his remains have lain in state at the Union Buildings, the seat of South Africa's government in Pretoria. Across the country and around the world, leaders and ordinary people have been paying their last respects to a man who's widely regarded as one of the giants of the modern age. Nelson Mandela preached a unique brand of hope and reconciliation as he shepherded a deeply divided country from the hated system of apartheid to a non-racial democracy. South Africans of all colours will now be looking to the future with a certain amount of apprehension as they come to grips with the passing of their revered leader. Anand Naidoo, CCTV, Johannesburg.
Joining me now to discuss how South Africa can move forward after the death of its great leader is Adam Habib. He's the Vice-Chancellor at WITS University in Johannesburg, where Nelson Mandela once studied law. Welcome to the show, Mr. Habib. Thanks very much for taking time. I know this has to be a very emotional week for you, but let's look forward for just a second if we can. Nelson Mandela emerged from prison after 27 years with no vengeance in his mind. He was able to unify the nation, indeed invite the people who put him in prison to be part of the government. How does South Africa move forward from this point? Many people look at Nelson Mandela as the glue that held the country together.
Well, I think that Nelson Mandela made an enormous contribution to South Africa, but it's worth bearing in mind that his big contribution to South Africa was done in the mid-1990s. In 1993, when we were on the verge of a civil war, when Chris Hani was assassinated, Madiba put up an olive branch to the rest of the country. He asked young militants to stand down, and that act, together with the reconciliation exercises of the next 3 years, bought South Africa the political space to institutionalize its democracy. What we had was an independent press, we had an independent judiciary, a democratic parliament, a democratic government. And so he bought us the time to institutionalize our democracy. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that over the last 13 years, he's not been politically active. And in the last 6 years, he's been out of the public limelight. And so South Africa today, and moving forward, we have some enormous challenges. On the economic front, we have very high levels of economic inequality. We have social polarization in our society. But going forward has nothing to do with the passing away of Nelson Mandela. In a lot of ways, Nelson Mandela's contribution has already been done. He lived a life that was an enormously magnificent one in the service of South Africa and in the service of humanity. And I think our failures or our successes going forward is going to be the result of our own wisdom and our own foibles. I don't think it has anything to do with Nelson Mandela and his failures.
A couple of points. You talked about Chris Hani. He, of course, was an anti-apartheid leader, and his death did spark all that unrest that you spoke about. But Nelson Mandela had this respect of everybody, and he was still coming out for public events even when he was very sick in 2010. So I don't think you can just dismiss him as not being in the public limelight. If you look at the current president, President Zuma right now, his his administration's been so tarnished with controversy, accusations of fraud, corruption. Where is that going? What is the next election going to be like, and what is the mood of the country right now?
Look, I think that there is a rage at the base of society. I think that there people, our citizens, tend to be particularly angry. They're angry about two things. One is the levels of inequality in the society, and they find that abhorrent. People find it unacceptable that they are asked to make sacrifices when economic elites, people who are rich, political elites, people who are in the cabinet, are not prepared to make the kinds of sacrifices that they're asking ordinary people to make. I think the second thing that has tarnished the Zuma administration is the levels of corruption. Many of those close to him have been tarnished with one form of corruption or the other. Most recently, we have found out that he has spent, or he had sanctioned the spending of something like 206 million rand on his private home.
About $23 million US.
$20 million.
Yeah.
That's right, $20 million US on his private home. And that has created an enormous amount of anger in the society. So a couple of days ago at his memorial service, there was enormous amount of booing of Jacob Zuma whenever he appeared in the stadium, or whenever the cameras actually spanned on him. And so I think that there is a lot of anger. But I'm also responding by saying that I don't think that because Madiba has passed on, that suddenly South Africa is going to collapse into a kind of racial or civil war. I think that Madiba's contribution has ensured that democratic South Africa will survive. Democratic South Africa means that we do have a very opinionated citizenry. They make their voices heard. People like myself and many others will make their voices heard in the society, and that will continue. And I think that means that will we have a robust engagement? Absolutely. But is it likely to be a completely sanguine kind of movement forward? I don't think so. I think you can anticipate a very robust South Africa that's going to try and hold the government accountable.
He was the perfect leader at the perfect time. He set this framework up to allow South Africa to move forward in a unified fashion. Talk to me about some of those building blocks that he had that allowed the country to grow and prosper.
Well, I think that's a lovely question, because I think that often people talk about Madiba and his legacy as simply the issue of reconciliation and pragmatism. I think that are essential parts of who he was, but I think he was much more than that. Nelson Mandela believed in non-racialism. He believed in democracy. He believed in civil liberties. He believed in economic inclusion. And all of those things were central to who Nelson Mandela was. And if you want to truly honor him, then what one has to do is start honoring his entire legacy. I don't think what we can do is cherry pick what we like and what we find convenient and ignore what we don't find. I think this is a point that Barack Obama made at his memorial service. But I think it's a lesson that Barack Obama himself needs to heed. Because you can't truly honor Nelson Mandela and continue Guantanamo prison. You can't truly honor Madiba and have drones attacking foreign militants. That would be something that Nelson Mandela was particularly opposed to. Similarly, for South Africa's political leaders, you can't honor Nelson Mandela and then not make sacrifices on your own. Nelson Mandela, when he came to the presidency, took a salary cut. That is a lesson that says if you want to ask your people to sacrifice, you must sacrifice yourself. You can't honor Nelson Mandela if you engage in corruption. If you can't be, if you like, members of the corporate sector and say you want to honor Madiba, and you want to honor his legacy and then make investment decisions that simply look at shareholder value and doesn't look at its impact on the environment or its an impact on its society. So I think that there are lessons for all of us in Nelson Mandela's legacy. The simple thing we've got to remember is that we can't simply become responsive to those parts of him that we find convenient to be responsive to. We need to be responsive to his entire message.
To what degree was he frustrated later years in life when he would read and hear about the corruption going on, read and see the economic disparity that kind of stepped in and took place of the racial disparity that had plagued that nation for so long?
You know, I think Nelson Mandela wasn't a saint. He made some mistakes. He himself acknowledged it. So, and HIV/AIDS in 2005, he didn't respond as quickly as he should have. In 2001, he acknowledged that. And he spent the next couple of years advocating for reforms, and particularly the provision of antiretrovirals to HIV/AIDS sufferers. He even indicated publicly that his son had died out of, from HIV/AIDS. Similarly, some of the policies that he imposed on economic policies were not entirely appropriate. They were particularly conservative, and they increased economic inequalities. In 2001, he acknowledged that, and he actually wondered and was concerned about the economic polarization in the society and the levels of economic inequality. Nelson Mandela's greatness lay not that he didn't make mistakes. He made many mistakes, but he acknowledged those mistakes, and then he learned from them.
Very human.
And that was the big, I think, leadership, his sense of humanity, his acknowledgement that he was human, and he learned from those mistakes. And that's what I would like to see current leaders learn from. They not only need to acknowledge the mistakes, they need to learn lessons from the mistakes that they make. And Nelson Mandela did that. Many of our current leaders don't do that.
Let me ask you, you know a bit about being on a terrorist list. You suffered through that here in the U.S. What did Nelson Mandela think about the way in the 1980s, the Reagan administration, Margaret Thatcher, those administrations treated him? And then secondly, staying on the terrorist list until 2008. That's simply staggering to people to hear that.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely astounding. I think it's absolutely tragic that many of the people who now celebrate Nelson Mandela were precisely the very people who were against him being released from prison and made the accusation that he was a terrorist. I think it hurt him. But I think Madiba, as magnanimous as he was, looked beyond the simple mistakes of individuals. So when he came out of prison, he said that he can't actually harbor ill feelings towards the United States because he had taken that position, or towards the UK because they had taken that position. He acknowledged that there were mistakes, and then he said we need to move on, like he did for the relationship with the South African government and to the National Party that had kept him in prison for 27 years. This is what is so particularly attractive about Nelson Mandela, his magnanimity, his capacity to forgive, and his ability to use that forgiveness to create a platform on which to build a new society. And I think he did that for South Africa. I think he did that for the world, which is why we've had this outpouring of grief and celebration simultaneously for this life magnificently lived in the service of humanity.
Thank you so much for your time. Adam Habib, Vice-Chancellor, WITS University, we greatly appreciate your insight. Thanks again.